Thanks for coming out this afternoon. Sorry about the delay, but it was working perfectly just moments ago, but now it seems to be working perfectly again. So always those problems. My name is Hazel Marcus. I'm the director of the Research Institute of CSRE, and this is our second faculty seminar of the year. We often have them at noon, but we have today at 4 o'clock, so we could have a special event, which is to have a book signing along with a presentation today, and we're really thrilled. Let me first be sure to thank our co-sponsors of the events, because it's not just us. We're co-sponsored by Inspires, which is the Institute on the Politics of Inequality, Race, and Ethnicity at Stanford, also by the Stanford Humanities Center, and also by IRIS, the Institute for Research in the Social Sciences. And because we have all these nice co-sponsors, I want to make sure that you know there'll be a very nice reception outside with some good food and drink as soon as we finish here today. And also, you will have a chance to buy a copy of the book. I've bought mine. I'm modeling this good behavior. I've looked through it. I can tell you'll want to buy it too. There are copies in the back. And we're asking, there's a sign-up sheet going around. Where is that, Mariam? From the Humanities Center, and it's circulating, and they just like to know who's here when we're using their venue. So without further ado, I will turn over now to Professor Corey Fields of the Department of Sociology, who's going to introduce our event today. Thank you.
Thanks. But you should probably save your clapping for people who actually deserve it. I'm just going to stand up here and read some stuff I read off the internet. So, no, seriously though. When I was asked to introduce Gary and Matt, I jumped at the chance. Who wouldn't want an opportunity to, sing the praises of elite scholars who've actually managed to turn academic work into stuff that people in the world actually care about, right? This is a model for new professors like myself. But the excitement actually turned a little bit to nervousness when I was like, okay, now that I've said yes, it's like, wait a minute, what am I going to do? How do you do these things? So I thought the best way to go about this was to put myself back in the position of when I'm in the audience of these things, and I'm like, just get out of the way and let me get to the thing I came here to see. So in the spirit of that, I will introduce Matt and Gary. So Matt Barreto is a professor of political science and an adjunct professor at the law school at the University of Washington. He's published more than 40 scholarly research articles and book chapters that examine Latino public opinion, voting behavior, and racial politics more generally. He's authored 2 books, the Ethnic Cues, and as well as Can't Change They Can't Believe In, the Tea Party and Reactionary Politics in America. So those of you who know me know I study the politics of the right, so I plan on monopolizing a great deal of Matt's time over dinner afterwards. Moving on to Gary Segura, man who needs no introduction around here, but I've been charged with introducing him, so I will do that. He's a professor of American politics and the chair of the Latino Studies here at Stanford, much beloved by his colleagues. I feel like that goes without saying. His work focuses on political representation and the politics of America's growing Latino community. Gary has published more than any reasonable introduction can be expected to cover, so I won't even try. But he is, one of the principal investigators of the American National Election Studies, a past president of both the Midwest Political Science Association and the Western Political Science Association. So he gets around. He takes this stuff regionally across the board. And impressively, he's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Together, Matt and Gary co-founded Latino Decisions, a company known as the gold standard of Latino American polling. And that's not just my introduction puffery. Like, someone actually said that about the company, Time Magazine. Unless you've been in a hole the past week, these guys have been all over the media, dissecting, what do you call it? Pre-secting? A pre-mortem and a post-mortem of the most recent midterm elections. And we're lucky enough to have them here today to talk about their new book. a book that immediately upon its release, I think, became a must-read for anyone looking to understand not just Latino politics, but American politics writ large. And that's, again, not just puffery. It's an important book about an important population in its own right, but also a population that's redefining what American politics is going to look like. So in the spirit of getting to the good stuff, I'm going to shut up. But before I do, I want you all to join me in welcoming Matt and Gary.
So 3 preamble comments. The first preamble comment is my apologies to Tomas Jimenez, because people keep introducing me as the chair of Chicano Studies, which I happily gave up about 2 months ago. So websites need to be updated. The second preamble is that this was the proof copy of the cover of the book. So when you see Greek quote, Greek quote, Greek quote, it was supposed to say Mexican quote, Mexican quote, Mexican quote. And actually, the real quote is from Jorge Ramos, the anchor of Univision Evening News. So that was like the biggest get ever. And you know, Matt and I are kind of fanboys when it comes to Jorge and the effect he has on the national community. So those 2 preambles were important. And the third is that describing our discussion of this election as a pre-mortem and a post-mortem seems very accurate, because mortem it was. And we're actually, even though it's not really in the book, because the arrow of time points in only one direction, we are going to say a little bit about what we found for this past week in the large poll that we did. So we're going to talk about our book. I'm going to introduce us a little bit, and then I'm going to turn it over to Matt, who'll tell you a little bit of the findings that we have just from this past weekend as a sort of background, and then we'll discuss the book, and we'll tag team it as we do on television and in Once Upon a Time in classrooms, and then we'll see what you have to say. So without further ado, I'm going to let Matt start.
All right, thanks, Gary. Thanks for the invitation, being here. Corey, thanks for the kind words in introducing us and setting the stage. As Gary said, the book has a section about looking forward. It was published on September 30th of this year, but we were already thinking about the research we were doing looking at the 2014 midterms and the 2016 election. So we're going to start with just a little bit of an overview about what happened on Tuesday and what some of our research suggests happened. So at the national summary level, Latinos were on the losing side of close electoral contests in most influence states. We had counted up to 18 contests that Latinos could have potentially influenced the outcome through strong participation and vote, historically matching perhaps the 10 or 12 numbers. And this only happened in 4 contests. In Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Colorado, gubernatorial contests were all decided by a very, very close margin. And the Latino population there, with their strong vote for the Democratic candidates in those 3 states, was enough to create the margin of victory. And the Virginia Senate election, which wasn't even on people's radar screens because it was said to not be a competitive state at all. In fact, it was in the safe Democratic column heading into the final weekend. And of course, it was decided by less than half of a percentage point there. And the Latino population in Virginia is quite large and growing, in another state where that vote was quite strong for Mark Warner. Across most contests, though, one of the real big takeaways was that the Latino vote share was less Democratic than 2, 4, and 6 years ago. And I want to be clear in stating that the Latino vote and describing the Latino vote as being less Democratic and not necessarily more Republican. There was really only one instance that we found in which there were substantial Republican gains for a Republican candidate among Hispanics. Generally, how we found in our data was that it was losses by the Democrats, and it didn't necessarily mean that these folks were transitioning. Perhaps they were sitting out the election. They weren't enthused by the options and what those candidates stood for, and it wasn't as though the other party was providing better options, something we'll talk about a little bit. So what did we find? Gary and I conducted a large Latino, what we call election eve poll of voters. We did this in the 3 or 4 days leading up to the election. We collected 5,300 interviews in about 4 or 5 days. It was quite hectic. We did this at the state level across 10 individual states that we thought would be quite close. And then we also had a national sample. Overall, we found the Latino vote continued to trend very heavily Democratic in this election, 67% to 28% when we aggregate the Senate contests. And this went from a high in Illinois of 81% for Dick Durbin to a low in North Carolina of 63% for Kay Hagan. In Kansas, the independent candidate, Greg Orman, was estimated to have gotten 64%. So we did see significant variation there, and we think that this slide, just as a starting point, suggests quite the contrast. Dick Durbin has been one of the strongest champions of the DREAM Act and comprehensive immigration reform. He's been working to try to get the DREAM Act passed for more than 10 years. Kay Hagan voted no against the DREAM Act in 2010 after it had already passed the U.S. House and could have become law in September of 2010. She was one of 4 Democrats to vote no. Had they all voted yes, the DREAM Act would be a law right now. But Hagan was part of that coalition of some Democrats in the South and the Southeast that voted no on that. And you can see a significant drop-off in her support from the Latino community as compared to someone like Dick Durbin, still outpacing her opponent by 2-1. One of the important takeaways that we also want to highlight, and Gary and I are going to be writing a lot more about this in coming weeks and months, depending on our time availability, is that the exit polls also report some data about Hispanics and Latinos. The reason we started doing not only this entire enterprise that we write about in the book of Latino decisions, but specifically the election eve poll, where we do our own essential exit poll, is that the exit polls do a really, really bad job at capturing the Latino vote. They generally are only available exit poll ballots in English. They only usually choose about 25 or so locations in a state as big as Texas to interview in. And in some past instances, they've had super majorities of the Hispanic respondents having college degrees. And so they're not getting the right sort of mix of the true population. This year, the exit polls reported that Greg Abbott, the Republican candidate for governor, won 44% of the Hispanic vote. And you can see, just from the map, the Rio Grande Valley counties there are all very heavily blue. And if you click on those, you can see that he's nowhere near this 44% estimate in any of the counties that are 90% or higher Latino. He's in the 20s, the mid-20s to low 20s. And we found that he does do slightly better in other parts of the state. This is real election data. Yet the national exit polls reporting they made 44%. And that has become part of the story already. And so that's something that we're thinking about and looking at. How do you accurately capture the opinions of our community, of our population, so that we don't have to rely on some faulty data? Not just to say that this person couldn't have won 44%, but these same errors they make will affect how we look at Hispanic opinion on a variety of topics. So one of the stories of the 2014 election is that neither party is getting strong approval ratings from Latino voters. This is among people who actually voted in the election. Only 48% believe that the Democratic Party, quote, truly cares about Hispanics. 36%, if you add those 2 bars in the middle, think the Democrats don't care or actually being hostile towards Hispanics. Those might be folks in places like North Carolina or Kentucky, where the Democratic candidates were the more anti-immigrant candidates. The Republicans have far worse marks. Only 22% think that the Republicans truly care, and 65%. If you add those middle bars, 65% think the Republicans don't care that much or are sometimes hostile. Why we describe the election as a bit of a lack of enthusiasm for Hispanics. Nobody was really winning the Latino vote this year. So we asked people, what's your motivation for voting? And I heard the same exact slide being discussed in the national exit polls when looking at a lot of the Republican voters. And across the board, Republican voters in the national exit poll sample, over 90%. Were saying that the reason that they were voting in the election was to vote against Obama, that it was this extremely strong partisan cue. That's what drove them to vote either for their Republican Senate candidate or against the president. For Hispanics, we found that the number one answer was to say to support the Latino community, not necessarily picking one candidate or the other. 37%, you can see there in the middle, say was to support the Latino community. Then the next answer people gave was to support a Democrat, followed by a Republican. So it's a community response to voting, not necessarily driven by the parties. The question that we've probably been asked the most in leading up to the election was what happened when the president decided that he would delay executive action on immigration and not implement those changes to the immigration system. He announced on June 30th in the Rose Garden that before the election, that by the end of the summer, he would implement a new system to stop the deportations of millions of immigrants in the country. And then he decided that he would not do that. From a sample of our survey of people who did not vote, when we were calling people and they said, no, I'm absolutely not voting tomorrow, leave me alone, I don't want nothing to do with this. We said, well, just answer a couple of questions for us. And one of the things we asked them was, how did Obama's delay make you feel? 60% said that made them feel less enthusiastic about the Democrats and wanting to vote. So we think it really did have a dampening effect in perhaps some key states. And again, the takeaway was that the Democratic vote was less. Here you have a chart that just shows in 10, 12, and 14, just something that we compare across all elections, the generic congressional ballot. How did Hispanics vote in 2014 compared to previous years? And in every instance outside of Florida, which is a story about changing demographics there as well, sort of a mini story about what our entire book is about, in every other state, the Democrats did worse than they did in 2010 or 2012. They lost anywhere from 4 points to 17 points in Nevada. And so it was an electorate. And we don't think that those votes necessarily voted Republican. We think they probably didn't vote. And the last thing I'll say before I'll turn it back over to Gary to start giving you an overview of the demographic section of our book is that we think this was particularly strong in Colorado. Colorado was identified as a very important Hispanic battleground state, has a very large population of Latinos in Colorado, was expected to be a neck-and-neck, extremely close Senate race between Mark Udall and Cory Gardner. And Mark Udall was one of the first U.S. senators to come out and criticize the president and say, I disagree with this delay. You should implement these executive orders immediately. He said it on the same day, September 6th. That the president did that. Then that also became the last time he said the word immigration. He stopped talking about it because he had believed that there was somehow a community of moderate yet anti-immigrant voters who were ready to vote Democrat but didn't want to hear him keep talking about this. And so we asked Hispanics in our sample, 47% did not know where Mark Udall stood on the immigration issue. They didn't know what his position was. They didn't know that he was a supporter of immigration reform. And likewise, 40% didn't know where his Republican opponent, Cory Gardner, stood on it, including 21% who actually thought that he was a supporter of immigration reform, which was not the case. And so we think this was a huge missed opportunity to lean in on the issue and reach out. We think that happened in a number of places, not just in Colorado. We're happy to talk more afterwards about the 2014 election. This is about a 10% synopsis of an hour-long presentation that Gary and I gave yesterday at the National Press Club in D.C., talking about these results. And so we just wanted to share a little bit, just because of the timing of this talk happening 2 days after the election. Thank you. I'll be back later.
All right, now for the book. And as you can see, one of the problems of writing on practical politics is that events frequently overtake publication schedules. And so our goal in writing this book was to have a public-facing book that integrated what we've learned over the last 7 years at Latino Decisions. And by public-facing, it's meant for a broader readership. I did, however, take some none too gentle ribbing from our colleague Sammy Alim, who pointed out that there's actually a data table on page 2. But nevertheless, it's meant to be a publicly facing book that is accessible to the general population. So we have 6 points that we're going to cover about the book today. The book has a few more than that, I think, but these are the ones we're going to highlight. First, that Latinos are reshaping American political demography. Second, that Latinos are ideologically progressive, and we'll have a lot to say about some myths there about Latino voters. The third, we're going to explore a little bit the question of mobilization and turnout and why those are puzzles for Latinos. We're going to think a little bit about how to theorize Latino political power. So for those of you who want to get your academic on, it's in there, I promise. Fifth, we're going to talk about what we call the Prop 187 effect. It's something we've talked a lot about because it remade California politics, and we think it has the potential to remake American politics. And finally, we're going to talk about Latino views on some other policy issues of importance that are kind of shaping how they interact with the political system. All right, so we're going to start with partisan demography. I've put this chart up in the past. A number of you have seen it. And what that chart suggests is going all the way back to the 2004 election, all the way through Obama's re-election in 2012. The racial and ethnic pattern in American voting has been stable for that entire period. That is, Republicans win a majority of white votes, and white voters make up about 90% of Republican ballots cast. And they lose in every other racial and ethnic demographic group in the country. And that has been true in 2004. But what about Tuesday night's wave? Well, in Tuesday night's wave, the pattern is exactly the same. Latino voters voted 69-27 for Democratic candidates for the House of Representatives. Asian American and Pacific Islanders voted 66-34 Democratic. African American voters voted 89-10 Democratic. And white voters voted 60-38 Republican. There's been some stories in the Washington Post and elsewhere that the Democrats and progressives have been wringing their hands yesterday trying to come up with plans how to win back white voters, when in fact their white voter percentage this year was exactly the same as what it was 2 and 4 years ago. Where the Democrats lost this year was in support among communities of color and elements of the rising American electorate who were disenchanted with the party's leadership. So what do these numbers mean? Republican presidential candidates get most of their votes from non-Hispanic whites. 87.6% in 04, 88.5% in 08, 89.4% in 2012, and this year about 90%. So Republican congressional candidates get an even greater share, around 90%. So that's the approximate share of all Republican voters that come from non-Hispanic white voters. The only other number I want to share about this, we're not going to talk about it in depth, is about elected officials. If you look nationwide, the Republicans like to tout the elections of the rare African American or Latino to public office that is from the Republican Party. If you look nationwide in all legislatures and in the Congress, 1.9% of all GOP office holders are people of color. That's adding together Native Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, and Latinos. In fact, the last year I gathered Senate data. It turns out that if you look across the 49 state senates in the United States, there were exactly 12 Republican state senators of color in the entire country. You could have them and their spouses to dinner and have room for others. Now, there's a worrisome slide for the GOP. This is not about Latinos, but as you can see, this is the history of two-party vote among various communities of color. The blue line is African Americans, and since the 1960s, that's stabilized in the, between 85 and 95%. The yellow line is Latinos, in the early years mostly Mexican American, but more recently more diverse, and it has stabilized at about 2/3, though we think in the last two elections it's been slightly higher. But the third line is Asian Americans, the orange line, and I think that's the really interesting one. In 1992, Asian Americans gave 31% of their votes to Democrats. In 2008, that number was 62. It doubled. In 2012, that number was 73. 2 nights ago, we think the number was 66. So in one generation, Asian Americans have gone from a supermajority Republican voting bloc to a supermajority Democratic voting bloc. And so we can talk more about that if that's of interest. So what's happening, the reason we want to talk about the racial composition of each party's votes is that the racial composition of the United States is changing. So the United States is becoming significantly less white and significantly more Latino, which is the red line, and Asian American, the gray line at the bottom. The blue line is the African American population, which has stabilized. It's going to hover about 13% for most of the rest of this century, at least according to the Census Bureau projections. That means that political demography in the United States is changing. Now, the census categories keep changing historically for anyone who's studied the census. But if you look in 1980 under the column non-Hispanic white, you'll see that when Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States, 79.6% of all Americans identified as being non-Hispanic white. As of the 2010 census 4 years ago, that number had declined to 63.7%, and today that number is closer to 61%. It is likely that the unambiguously white share of the national population in 2020 will begin with the digit 5. Now, Latinos' disadvantages, however, are driven in part by a bad distribution of age. That is, we're really, really young. 42.3 is the median age of whites in the United States. 35.4 is the median age of Asians. 32.9 is the median age of African Americans. For Latinos, it is 27.6. Now, for those of you who study voting or have ever casually looked at a turnout table, you'll know that young people don't vote. And all Latinos are young people, or at least an awful lot of them are. And so this is a disadvantage that mercifully will erode with the passage of time. So the Latino vote will actually double in the next 20 years without a single additional naturalization taking place. So here's a number for you to take home today, 73,000. That is the number of Latino citizens of the United States who turn 18 and enter the eligible electorate every month. 73,000 potential voters a month. Now, population growth among Latinos occurs for 2 different reasons. One is babies. The other is immigration. Note, not all babies or immigrants are Mexican or of Latino origin. Now, that said, I am a homosexual and I have 3 kids. So you work it through and you can see that.
We all have kids.
We all have kids. So we're going to end this demography section with a reading from the book, which is customary, and it's a line from that I used in a press conference once that a friend of ours in D.C. insisted that I use over and over again, and that's demography is relentless. So if the past is prologue, the more than 53 million souls who make up this mostly new American community may well rewrite the political history of the United States. The demography is relentless. Live births contribute more to population growth among Latinos now than immigration does, and over 93% of Latinos under age 18 are citizens of the United States. There will be no stunning reversal of these numbers. There will be neither a sudden surge in white immigration and live births nor a Latino exodus. Every day, every congressional district in the United States and nearly every census tract becomes more Latino than it was the day before. So what do those Latinos think about politics? Well, minorities in the United States tend to be progressive. Now, in the United States, we tend to associate the term self-reliance with political conservatism. And when asked the question, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? If racial or ethnic minorities don't do well in life, they have no one but themselves to blame. A majority of Americans agree with that statement. It turns out, in fact, however, that about 60% of African Americans agree with that statement, about 58% of Asian Americans agree with that statement, and a whopping 73% of Latinos agree with the statement that if minorities don't do well in life, they have only themselves to blame. Now, that's traditionally associated with conservatism in the white population. Not so among Latinos. We also ask Latinos the question, which of the two statements comes closer to your opinion? The less government, the better, or two, there are more things that government should be doing. While the white population is evenly divided, 53 to 47, 86.8% of African Americans, 82.1% of Latinos, and 68.8% of Asian Americans think the government should be doing more. Finally, I love this slide. We ask the question, which of the two statements comes closer to your own opinion? We need a strong government to handle today's complex problems, or the free market can handle these problems without government being involved. 64% of whites think the government needs to be involved. You're not going to hear that on Fox News tonight, but I promise you it's true. But even when 2/3 of whites believe in the progressive position, 85% of African Americans, 83% of Latinos, and 76% of Asian Americans also believe in the progressive position, again, putting them to the left of non-Hispanic whites. So will social issues save the GOP? This is a common myth we hear. Well, religion is certainly important to Latino voters. Latinos go to church more often than most Americans. And about 60% of our respondents in a religion poll that Latino Decisions did in 2011 said that religion provided quite a bit of guidance in their daily life. So Latino religiosity is certainly not a question, and Latino Catholics are more religious than non-Latino Catholics. That's a clear finding. But Latinos don't want religion in politics. In fact, when asked if religious leaders should tell their members which candidate to support, 82% of all Latinos and even 77% of born-again Latinos don't want that. When asked if politicians with strong religious beliefs should rely on those beliefs when making policy, again, 72% of all Latinos and 64% of the born-again don't want that. A strong majority of Latinos reject the explicit mixing of religion and politics. What is politics really about? Well, it turns out when given a choice between quote-unquote social issues and economic issues or bread and butter issues like the price of gas and jobs, 75% of Latinos think politics should be about these bread and butter issues. And when we ask people what's the most important problem facing America, overwhelmingly, those folks believe that it's going to be immigration or jobs or public safety or education, and it is never abortion or marriage equality or contraception or any of those. Adding all those together, that's about 2% of our respondents. So the culture wars are less important than meet the eye. Latinos are about 10% more conservative than whites on abortion rights, but among females, that difference is smaller, and among young people, that difference is smaller. Latinos now offer majority support for marriage equality, and among 18 to 35 Latinos, support for marriage equality is at 69%. And of course, neither of these issues is ever mentioned when we asked about the most important issue. So progressivism, notwithstanding, Catholicism is the description of the Latino ideology. And I'll read another passage and then turn it over to Matt. Claims and counterclaims regarding Latino policy preferences are built on two stereotypical ideas about Latinos, both incorrect. The first is that Latinos have evolved towards democratic partisanship by accident, that they're insufficiently informed, and that their policy preferences are inconsistent with their voting behavior. The second idea is that Latinos are so traditionalist and religious that a proper Republican outreach campaign would swing a large number of them into the GOP camp. Neither of these claims is true. And with that, I'll let Matt talk about voter turnout.
All right, thanks, Gary. As Gary has just identified, it is a very complex set of public opinion standards that Latinos have. And as a result of this, campaigns have often underestimated, misestimated, or overestimated what they need to do to get the Latino vote out. We know that there is a turnout gap, especially in midterm elections for Hispanics. And as we compare here the drop-off between a presidential year and a midterm year, we see that the Latino vote has been declining in these off-term elections. And we think, as I started with the opening segment today, that it happened again this year. Is this a function of Latinos being less interested in politics, of not having the proper information or motivation to vote, or is it more of a function of the parties not doing what it takes to get the Latino vote out, of reaching into our community, talking about issues that are important, and perhaps glossing over some of the stuff that is more prevalent in national presidential elections? And that's where we think the issue lands. But it's absolutely the case that these turnout numbers should and can be higher, and so there's much, much more work to be done. As Gary suggested earlier, the Latino population of voters will double in the next 20 years, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the number of votes cast will double unless the parties do outreach. So a big section of the book that we have is talking about what can motivate folks to come out to vote, how exactly do you motivate folks to come out to vote, and what has worked and what has not worked. One of the most important takeaways I think that we have here is that the outreach has to be culturally competent, and that is that politicians, campaigns, community groups have to understand the Latino community as a bicultural, bilingual community. We've asked respondents, and this comes from our 2012 election eve poll that we conducted, whether or not they get news and information about politics. Not do they watch sports or telenovelas, but do they get news and information about politics from English language TV, Spanish language TV, etc. And here what we have is the results of folks. How often do they get news and information from Spanish language TV? 38% of voters, not just of the Latino population overall, but 38% of voters are getting their news and information from Spanish language TV on a daily basis. And an additional 30% are occasional watchers, either tuning in weekly, perhaps just once a week to Jorge Ramos's Al Punto show on Sundays, or tuning in a little bit less frequently. But there's a very, very large percentage of folks who are getting information here. Campaigns don't necessarily understand this. When Gary and I were in Washington, D.C. about 2-3 months ago, in time for campaigns to still be doing outreach and engaging with Latinos, we were meeting with campaign director or person in charge of something, presumably, of Hispanic outreach, and we're asking for our ideas. And we shared this sort of information about Spanish language outreach, and the person said, well, we know that there's a lot that Univision has high ratings, but when it comes to voters, we know that they're only watching English language TV, that this idea continues to be held from people in Washington, D.C. who are doing outreach. If that's the case, it's no wonder that we have drop-off and turnout like this if they're not reaching out to our community in a culturally competent way. So that's number one, and that's a very, very important starting point. Number two is that there's some good lessons in our not-too-distant past. In 2012, we had a very, very different post-election symposium about Latinos. There were headlines about how can the Republican Party do better, that the Latino vote put Obama over the top in a variety of states, not just in Nevada or Colorado, but in many, many states there was a robust Latino turnout. And we know, and we were tracking this closely, that there was a very important policy position that the president took that really resonated and encouraged Latinos to vote. In our analysis that we detail in the book, this was not only something Latinos supported and agreed with, the June 2012 Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or the Executive Dream Act that was implemented, but it was directly tied to the decision to vote and the decision to vote for the president in 2012. It was a real policy accomplishment that the candidate, in this case, could point to, and that canvassers and outreach personnel could point to when they tried to convince our community to come out and vote. We think that was missing in 2014. Again, even as Gary identified that many Latinos are progressive, they don't have that strong partisan attachment of being diehard Democrats that other Americans might have. They need to be convinced that the candidates will actually stand for policies and support policies that we agree with, and this was the case in 2012. In addition to this, we've been often asked, what do we say to Latinos? What are the sort of messages that resonate? And one of the things that we've consistently found in recent years has been that the rhetoric surrounding the anti-immigrant laws that were really popular in Arizona but have spread across the country is something that makes people really frustrated about and really excited to vote about. And this is a reason why we think Udall perhaps should have leaned in more on the immigration issue and showed his contrast with Cory Gardner on this issue. One of the messages that we've tested repeatedly, and these are results are among people who are occasional voters, they're not the 4 out of 4 vote in every election, is telling them that many states are considering passing laws that discriminate against Latinos, like SB 1070 in Arizona. Only by voting can we change these laws. 73% of Latinos found this message as a convincing reason to vote, really the highest message we've been finding in recent times as what is encouraging Latinos to vote, to push back, unfortunately, a message to push back against a system that continues to discriminate. Who are the best messengers? We often get asked, who should we put on those mailers? Who should we put in TV ads and radio ads? Who is trusted? And the number one thing that ends up coming back, and we've tested dozens of different types of people, the number one thing that resonates is someone from the community. Teachers are almost always at the top of the list, but Hispanic teachers. Firefighters and police are respected figures in the community, but Hispanic firefighters and police. And on down the list, these are sources that are trusted. And so by doing that sort of outreach, culturally competent again, matching these mailers of saying other Latino teachers stand for this issue, it allows people in our community to feel like they're being represented by politics, and they're much, much more likely to participate.
Tell them who's number one.
The number one motivator in terms of getting people out to vote. We did this project, I think this is probably where you want me to go. We did this project for NALEO, the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, and we had been studying these sorts of things for them for quite some time. You can see there, they're actually the source of this slide. And Arturo Vargas, who's a Stanford alum, asked us to look in more detail that he was convinced that maybe the real motivator would be your mother. And so we asked people in a follow-up study, what if your mom called you and said, "Mijo, you need to get out and vote"? And it was like 89%. And the reason we couldn't put it in there is that he couldn't actually implement that. He couldn't convince every Hispanic mother to call their children and get them out to vote. But when we read that, there was a very, very high response rate. And it actually came as a follow-up to this research that we did for Arturo, in which friends or family was the number one motivator. We knew that was important. He said, I think it's the mother. And we asked everyone, father, cousin, abuelo, abuela, all the way down the list, and it was mother. So they're actually doing some follow-up work on that based on some research Gary and I have done to try to figure out through either social media or other sorts of ways to get more mothers calling their kids and asking them to vote. Now let me transition and talk a little bit about how do we think about Latino influence. As I said at the very start, we went into this election thinking that there was maybe as many as 18 opportunities for Latinos to swing the outcome in elections, and it turned out to be 4. But that doesn't mean that Latino influence was gone. We got asked in the aftermath by a lot of reporters, does this mean Hispanics were irrelevant on Tuesday? And we said, no, if you look after the fact only, you're missing what's happening during the campaign. And so I want to give you a little bit of a way to perhaps think about this. And we have a whole chapter in the book trying to challenge a lot of the conventional wisdom about how do we think about influence that our community has. A lot of the existing work by pundits, and including some other scholars, proposes to only look at post-election outcomes and to try to determine if Latinos cast the winning votes. So I said in this year there was only 4. And we think that view is overly restrictive for a couple of reasons. Now, that's not the only way that the community might be influential. And secondly, it doesn't allow us to test and assess and observe Latino influence in real time in August, September, October, up until Election Day. If you wait until after the election and try to do some sort of mathematical proof, you're missing what's happening. So we propose to look at key dynamic measures. First of all, the growth rate of the Latino electorate. We think we're more influential where a community is growing, perhaps even more so than a state that has a large Latino population. We'll never convince anyone that New Mexico is not a Latino influence state at about 45% of the state population, but its growth rate is slower because the population has historically been big. And so it's not taking anybody by surprise. It's not something that's dynamic there. But in other states, as I'll show you soon, it is. And we think that growth is a way to measure influence. If your community is growing onto the scene, whether it's statewide or in a certain community, you're going to start getting more influence in the outcomes. Secondly, of course, we have to take account for how competitive the overall state is. And that's something that in some instances makes California and Texas, states with huge Latino populations, not necessarily at the top of a metric of Latino influence. And so there's other ways to think about that as well. What we propose to look at is how many resources are going into Latino outreach, whether or not the campaigns are aware of the Latino community. Are they spending money on us? Are they going after us? Is this part of their strategy? If that's the case, and somehow, some way, we're influencing the outcome of that election, and we go into much more detail about this. There's a number of different things that you can look at, but we reject the idea that you can only do this in a post-election environment. I'm going to show you a slide here that's hard to read, but I'm going to call your attention to just a couple of different things. These are the top 15 states of Hispanic registration growth in the last decade. You notice that all of these 15 states have over 200% growth rate from 2000 to 2012. That means that at a minimum it tripled. And in the case of some states, like Tennessee or Rhode Island, it grew by 800%. Let me show you what this means. In Tennessee, there was 11,000 Latino registered voters in 2000, and it grew to 107,000, a growth of 96,000 people. That's enough to swing an election outcome. Sometimes in these medium-sized states, we're talking about differences. The North Carolina, which is a large state, was decided by 40,000 votes. Virginia, which is even a larger state, was decided by less than that, 20,000 votes or so. From 11 to 107 in 10 years or so. Kansas, a state that was on our map this year for the first time, went from 8,000 Latino registered voters to 54,000 Latino registered voters, and now makes up over 6%, 10% of the population. Georgia went from 26,000 to 140, from 26 to 140 in just 10 years. You can see that's a growth rate of 438%. These are the sorts of metrics that we outline as saying this means we're influential. People are starting to pay attention to the Latino vote in Georgia, to the Latino vote in Kansas, and North Carolina, a state again this year that was decided by a very close margin, and perhaps the Latino vote was influential in a state like North Carolina because of the lack of the vote for Kay Hagan and her ultimate loss by just a very, very narrow margin. And finally, a state like Nevada is one that I always like to highlight that went from 53,000 to 180,000 and is now one of the most important Latino influence states. If you go back into the 90s and take this number back further, Latinos were only maybe 3% of Nevada voters. Now they're upwards of 17% or so. So the growth is something that we can see coming, and we can say that a state like a Rhode Island, which is number 2 on the list, the gubernatorial candidate there, Gina Raimundo, won by only 3.5 points or something like that, probably because of this growth that had been there. The other thing to think about, though, is whether or not campaigns are reaching Latinos. And in 2014, these states in purple are states where there was Spanish language radio or TV ads targeting Latinos. They're investing. It's not just in California and Texas, but in all of these states, there was at least one Spanish language radio or TV ad directly trying to get Latino votes. That's taking resources away from another part of the campaign and putting it there, and we think that's a measure of influence. Now, on the downside, much of this spending was driven by Latino civic groups. The Latino Victory Project, which is a new organization in Washington, D.C., spent heavily on Spanish language radio and TV across the states. The National Council of La Raza spent heavily. Mi Familia Vota spent heavily. And it wasn't always the candidates themselves who were trying to spend. When we get to that level, like it was in Colorado, like it was in Florida, like it was in Texas, that's a much better measure or metric of Latino influence.
Why is all this important? Well, it's all important because we think this is the process that's changing American elections. And we don't need to speculate on this. It turns out we have a case study, and the case study is the land that you're sitting in, California. And the past in California is prologue, we think, for the American political future. Before Pete Wilson's re-election and the passage of Prop 187 20 years ago this week, California was actually a very competitive state for the GOP. Most people don't realize that. So there's been a lot of research published in academic journals. This is a little unfair because it's a third-party reference, and I wrote a fair amount of this. But extensive polling demonstrates that the 94 election becomes a real inflection point in California politics. And so now nationally, we think the GOP faces the same question. So the California legislature going into this election was 2/3 Democratic in both of its chambers. Democrats in California held all 8 executive offices and both U.S. Senate seats. So if we go back to the 187 period, we had a Republican governor. The Republicans won 9 of 10 presidential elections here between 1952 and 1988. This was a Republican state in presidential politics. We had 1 Republican and 1 Democratic senator. The U.S. House delegation after the 94 election was exactly 50-50, Democrat and Republican. The Democrats controlled the Senate modestly, but the Republicans controlled the Assembly by a narrow margin. And today you have the numbers I just read you. The Democrats overwhelmingly control the policy in this state. And in fact, because of their 2/3 majorities in both chambers, at least up until Tuesday, the Democrats could actually pass any legislation they liked without any Republican votes on any measure. So the legacy of Pete Wilson and his passage of 187 continues to today. In a 2010 poll we did, we asked our respondents whether or not they were concerned that Meg Whitman, the GOP nominee that year, had recruited Pete Wilson as one of the co-chairs of her campaign. And what's interesting here is that 86% of those 18 to 30 were concerned or very concerned that Pete Wilson was a co-chair of her campaign. Now keep in mind that the 18 to 30-year-olds in 2010 were ages 2 to 14 when Prop 187 passed. So Pete Wilson did succeed in enshrining his name in Latino political history, but perhaps not in the way that he originally intended. These charts show the change in the statewide 2-party vote since 1980 through the 2012 election, that's the lower bar, and the share of the Latino vote that went Democratic in the upper bar. And as you can see, those two things are deeply correlated. And in parentheses above each of those upper numbers, ending with 22% in 2012, you see the share of the California electorate that was comprised of Latinos or Hispanics. So what about Texas? Texas is the other giant Latino state, and everybody knows Texas is a Republican state, right? Turns out Texas is a majority-minority state today. People always ask us, when does Texas go blue, like we have a secret date in mind. Our co-principal Sylvia Manzano likes to say this. It's like, we know that on March the 18th, 2019, Texas becomes a Democratic state. Well, it doesn't work that way, and the true answer is that Texas is a blue state now. It is almost certainly the case that a majority of the Texas eligible electorate today are Democratic leaning. That is not the electorate that shows up at the polls for a variety of historical reasons and a lot of voter suppression. It turns out that the transition that California experienced in April of this year, where Latinos surpassed whites as the plurality population in the state, is going to happen in Texas before 2020. And in fact, Latinos will be an outright majority of the state of Texas's population by 2040. I love to give these slides in Texas. So the takeaways here are that without getting immigration right, without getting immigration off the table, it's going to be very, very difficult for the GOP in the coming years to win a deeper share of the Latino vote. And that is true even when the Democrats drop the ball, as they did this year. Until immigration is off the table, the rest is just noise. Now, Latinos are interested in a variety of political issues, and we're going to end with Matt telling you about some other things Latinos think.
So we spent a fair amount of time in the book and also in our discussions in political circles talking about why immigration is such an important issue. And we finally asked a question this year on a survey that we did earlier because we got a little bit of pushback that it can't be the only issue. We certainly don't agree with that. It is not the only issue. But we asked a question that said, as long as this issue remains unresolved and you have one party really leaning in and attacking immigrants, that is what is making it stay on the table as the most salient issue. But by no measure is it the only issue that Latinos want to see policy action on. It's just one that is sort of in our face right now every single day, and one that we absolutely do want to see resolved. So we asked about the federal budget deficit, and this is something that could be extremely important going into a Republican Congress. They're certainly going to be talking about cutting the budget deficit, and now that they have majorities in both houses, they'll be pushing some aggressive proposals to cut the budget deficit. This comes from our poll on Tuesday, and you can see there in the middle nationally, 35% in the middle want to solve the budget deficit by creating more revenue by raising taxes on the wealthy. An additional 35% want to have a combination of some cuts and some spending increases. And only 14% of Latinos nationally, far lower than the number of votes that even Republicans get, which suggests that some independents and Republican Latinos also reject this approach, want to go with the spending-only cuts. Latinos, as Gary highlighted earlier, believe that there is a proper role for government. They don't believe in just cutting back all sorts of services, but rather making sure that the government that's there is one that's operating effectively and providing services. We asked about support for the minimum wage. This issue was actually on the ballot in some states this year. And 78% nationally, and again, this includes fairly healthy shares of independents and Republicans, believe that we should increase the minimum wage nationally to $10.10. Only 18% oppose that. Again, for a very high percentage of Latino voters find themselves, or perhaps their parents, in working class jobs that are at the level of minimum wage. Just by this minimum wage change would dramatically change the lives of many working class Latinos today, and there's very, very strong support for this. This is an issue that we found very, very salient in our polling. Perhaps the issue besides immigration that is at the forefront, that is the most salient to Latinos today, is healthcare. There was very, very high support for the Affordable Care Act, and now that it has been in effect for a while, the current debate is over expanding Medicaid. And these are the 5 states in our poll that currently did not expand Medicaid. And we asked people, should Medicaid be expanded so that more people have access to health insurance? And overwhelmingly, 77% in the states combined said yes, Medicaid should be expanded and more people should have access. Today, Latinos continue to be the ethnic group with the highest rates of being uninsured. And so just by expanding Medicaid, which the federal government will pay 90% of the cost for 10 years, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Latino households would gain access to health insurance that they currently don't have. In separate studies that we've done on health insurance specifically, we find that this is the number one cause of financial stress on Latino households is medical cost. Many people without insurance are only seeking medical treatment at emergency rooms or not seeking treatment at all because of the cost. Finally, something that we've been talking a lot about in recent years is Latino views on the environment. Latinos, as compared to every ethnic group in the United States or any subgroup in the crosstabs of any sort of national data, have the highest rates of support for government action to address climate change. There's no other group, even though the environmental movement is often seen as a movement that is led by white, middle, and upper class individuals. Latinos have by far 10 and in some cases 20 points the highest rates of support for protecting the environment, for conserving natural resources, and for government involvement to take measures to reduce. We found in our Election Eve poll 68% think that it is either very or extremely important to address this issue. And finally, I think this is the last policy issue that we talk about, immigration, because it has been unresolved, remains important. We had asked leading up to the election if the president does move forward and supports a policy that would stop, and this is one that is on the table, stop the deportation of any parent that has U.S.-born children or is a parent of a dreamer who is already eligible for deferred action. Would that make you more enthusiastic or less enthusiastic about coming out and supporting the Democratic ticket? Overwhelmingly, 87% said that this would make them more excited, a policy they agreed with, more enthusiastic about supporting the Democratic ticket. Well, we know in hindsight now that that never happened. We saw the results that in many key states where Latinos had a large population, Democrats lost extremely close races. And this is something that we know. In the press conference yesterday afternoon, the president said he will enact now before the end of the year. That's good news for Latino families who are facing deportations. I believe the number is 1,100 a day who are deported in this country. So that's good news that that will happen. Politically, it's obviously too late to have helped. This 87% enthusiasm that we had gauged was obviously not there on Tuesday. I'll let you wrap it up, Gary.
So we're going to close with a quote from the last chapter of the book, the conclusion, and then we'll sit down and hear any questions you might have. So with some final thoughts, We have made the case in these last pages that Latinos have the capacity to reshape the American political system and have in fact begun to do so. As a consequence of both their growing numbers and the ability or inability of political parties to accommodate them, Latinos have completely reshaped California politics, begun to have a national impact in Senate elections and presidential popular vote, and become politically engaged in a widening variety of issues. Almost without exception, the majority of Latino political attitudes fall on the side of collectivism and mutual responsibility, the belief that government can and should act to improve the lives of their citizens. Latinos have not shown themselves to be a monolithic bloc. There are too many differences among them to expect lockstep unity. We are cautious about oversimplifying the positions of Latinos. Even today, 1/4 of Latinos are reliably Republican, and there's every reason to expect that should the GOP revise and improve its outreach message to Latinos and get the issue of immigration off the table, the party could easily recover and collect 1/3 of Latino votes, maybe more. Moreover, politics sometimes change. 100 years ago, African Americans were understood as a Republican constituency group, which is hardly imaginable today. African Americans shifted in their ideological and partisan preferences over the years, however, as events and new issues arose, and the same will happen with Latinos. On the other hand, it is hard for us to conceive of a set of circumstances that would shift Latinos to the GOP in large numbers anytime soon. We have 3 reasons for thinking so. First, the role of race in the GOP coalition is profound and dates back to Richard Nixon. Second, the religious engine of evangelical Christianity and Mormonism, which has played a powerful role in the GOP for so long, has proved far less effective among Latinos. And finally, it's difficult to know who, in the present GOP, would lead such an outreach effort. Demography may not be destiny, but it dramatically constrains the range of the possible. And with that, we'll stop and take your questions.
Thank you.